I'm going to introduce Martha and just to say how pleased I am that she has agreed to do this two-part series on women in Scripture titled Not About Us Without Us. And I think that's wonderful. Martha is a deaconess in the Methodist tradition. She speaks at retreats, at conferences, at church. She's a dear, dear friend, and I'm really, really thrilled to welcome her to class. And when we get done, I am recording the class as we usually do, but it will be published in the quote, other classes section of the website. Um, and will be available there as usual. And of course, I'll send emails and post on social media. So you'll have all the ways to go back and listen to Martha's words again. Martha?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Gail and everybody. It's pretty exciting for me to get to share what's really just bubbled and bubbled and bubbled in me, listening to so many different sources, what Gail has taught us, things that just keep coming up, things I never noticed or never thought about in a particular way. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to need to put this together in some sort of a coherent fashion. So here we go. So one of the things that I looked at is what is the prevalence of women in the scriptures? There's 200 named women in the Hebrew and Christian canon. There's 350 unnamed individuals or groups of women in the Old Testament. 95 unnamed in the Apocrypha or hard to say,
Deuterocanonical.
Deuterocanonical, thank you, books, on 146 in the New Testament. Of course, some of those show up multiple times because they show up in several of the synoptic gospels. And then 49 female deities and personifications. An invaluable resource to me. I will share that source. It's a dictionary of all of the women in the canon and was published in the year 2000. I'm going to talk about that more here in just a minute. But there's a lot of us there. We're everywhere in the scriptures. Feminist biblical scholarship has its roots in the women's suffrage movement. So it took until the women's suffrage movement in the United States for it to get serious, to look at women by women. And Lucy Stone was one of the suffragettes who intentionally learned the biblical languages, hoping to properly translate the scriptures, believing that that would support women's rights. Sojourner Truth and other Black women did work in this regard in the 1830s and the 1840s. And more recently, if you hear womanist, that typically refers to Black women interpreting scriptures from the perspective, the insights of Black women with good scholarship as a whole package. Elizabeth Cady Stanton led the effort to compile the Women's Bible in order to interpret the Bible in a way that affirmed women's full humanity and thus to combat the interpretations that were used by men to hold women back. The Society of Biblical Literature, which was founded in 1880, took 15 years to admit women, but there were barriers to the full participation of women well into the second decade of the 20th century. A woman named Edith Dean made the first attempt to list all the named women and in a chronological listing. This was in 1955, but that listing wasn't without its limitations. It was obviously a pious, incomplete work, and it includes details that aren't provided in the biblical text. But it was work that moved this forward. So despite these and subsequent titles, it took until the year 2000 for the book that I referred to, Women in Scripture, a dictionary of named and unnamed women in the Hebrew Bible, and the subtitle goes on. That came out in 2000. Backing up just a little bit, the women's movement in the 20th century also had an impact. Scholarship on women accelerated with a book called Women in the World of Religion by Elsie Culver in 1967. That took biblical scholars to task for their failure to research women's status and roles in the Bible. Subsequent work showed that the Bible contained both positive and negative material with respect to women. It was, after all, Herod's wife who instructed her daughter to ask her father to give her John the Baptist's head in Mark. So various approaches were applied to this work, and it's pointed out that everyone comes to the text with convictions, assumptions, and perspectives. They influence the questions we ask and the way we ask them, the approaches we use to find the answers, and the answers themselves. And this is information, a lot of the information that I'm providing here does come from the introductory chapters in that book that are referred to, Women in Scripture. And as we've learned in here and learned throughout our lives, the texts themselves are often open to a number of different interpretations. So in Esther, when the king demands that Vashti show up to the party wearing the royal crown to show the people and the officials her beauty, does she refuse because he expects her to appear nude? Or does she refuse because she doesn't want to appear even clothed before the drunken rowdy party? Would she have refused either way? It's a good question. Female characters are sometimes portrayed as strong and virtuous. Sometimes they're weak, victimized, or portrayed in negative ways. I mentioned Herod's wife. Does looking at the oppression of women in and through the Bible open us up to going beyond gender to address the whole range of categories of oppression? That's a question that's asked in that resource that I told you about. I think that's a really good question, is, are we going to stop there? And when you look at things like a womanist perspective, if you look at and now the name is escaping me. A liberation perspective. If you look at gender beyond women and men, can we use what we learn here to think about, well, how many perspectives are there, and can we learn something by looking through another lens? So even though it took a really long time before there was any serious scholarship about women in Scripture, it has indeed been a rich resource for women who are struggling to attain liberation and to live their lives fully as they were made to be. So here's my own take on a few things. My overall orientation to Scripture is that the Bible is both sufficient and it's incomplete. Creation is ongoing, and so is the story of redemption. Even, I think, what we are being redeemed from and what we are being redeemed to. It is very true that it was written down by men in patriarchal context. The canon was selected by men in a patriarchal context, and until very recently, translated only by men in patriarchal contexts, and interpreted, again, until very recently, similarly. And yet, did you hear those numbers that I mentioned earlier? Women are everywhere in Scripture. Everywhere. In the stories that were told, in the stories that were written down, in the stories that were selected, right? So I don't need to use this as a down with the patriarchy, but I need to know that the patriarchy definitely informed how we got to where we are today. And I think that that's important, but it's not, there's no need to dismiss on that basis. So women do play a central role in much of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. They rely on female characters, and not just women as only property, but as fully formed people. They're women who exercise agency and courage and influence and even power. Some are visible actors in the story, and others were surely there, but we can't see their faces. Perhaps we have forgotten how to, or we were trained not to notice them. So, what if we look again and pay attention to who they were and how they operated and how they moved the arc of the Judeo Christian faith traditions forward, even as they lived their own lives in their own time and places? Another source that I used is the CEB Women's Bible. It came out in 2013, 2016. I don't
2011.
have that.
It was 2011.
It was 2011. And all of the introductions, the reflections, the sidebar articles, and the portraits of the characters are written by women. It also includes an index of all the women in the Bible, named and unnamed, and some discussion questions. So I think it's also a really, really valuable resource. And of course, I consulted other resources, stories I've heard people tell, blog posts and whatnot. I approach this kind of in a study fashion. It's a little less scholarly than you'll get from Gail, but I believe that I chose reasonable sources. And Gail may have referenced some of the same things that I bring up over the course of the years that we've studied together, maybe in similar ways and maybe in different ways. But I think regardless of what she may have said over time, taking a look, taking some concentrated time to look at women over kind of together collectively as individuals in pairs with women as well as with men and thematically, I think that that's valuable. Spoiler alert, this one's for Anne and me. I've even been pleasantly surprised by Paul, and I wonder if you will be too. So here we have Hagar. And I'll read you briefly the story of Hagar. Abram said to Sarai, part of Hagar's story, since she's your servant, do whatever you wish to her, because Sarah was very unhappy when Hagar becomes pregnant with Abram's child. So she treated her harshly, and she ran away from Sarai. So Sarai treated her harshly. The Lord's messenger found Hagar at a spring in the desert, the spring on the road to Shur, and said, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where did you come from and where are you going to? She said, from Sarai, my mistress. I'm running away. The Lord's messenger said to her, go back to your mistress, put up with her harsh treatment of you. The Lord's messenger also said to her, I will give you many children, so many they can't be counted. The Lord's messenger said to her, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You will name him Ishmael because the Lord has heard about your harsh treatment. He will be a wild mule of a man. He will fight everyone and they will fight him. He will live at odds with all of his relatives. Hagar named the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi, because she said, can I still see after he saw me? Therefore, that well has been called Beer Lahai Roi. It's the well between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar gave birth to a son for Abram, and Abram named him Ishmael. Hagar named the Lord who spoke to her. Remember that we learned from Gail that if an angel shows up, it's probably God. She is the first character in the scriptures to give God a name. A woman did that. A woman did that. Fast forward into the New Testament. pairs on purpose in the Gospel of Luke. And I probably missed this if you talked about it, Gail. But I thought this was quite an interesting thing. So, someone named R. Herbert, in a Living with Faith blog post, I don't know who R. Herbert is because they write under a pseudonym. Their work seemed solid. There's a reason they're writing under a pseudonym. I can only speculate, which would not be fair, why they do that. But here's some excerpts from that blog post. R. Herbert does identify with the masculine, by the way. We tend to think of Luke as the most universal of the four Gospels. It's the life of Jesus that begins with its genealogy with Adam instead of Abraham, so it goes back farther. It stresses the importance of the Samaritans and other Gentiles, but there's a less noticeable yet equally pervasive inclusion that's in this gospel that was just as revolutionary for his day, and it's the inclusion of women. He says women are included at every point in the narrative in which a man is found. Luke structures his gospel around carefully arranged pairs of males and females. The angel Gabriel appears to both Zechariah and to Mary. Both Simeon and Anna recognize who Jesus is in the temple. Women and men are present at the death of Jesus and participate in seeing evidence of the resurrection. There were women in Jesus' traveling party. And for every miracle involving a male figure, there is a corresponding miracle involving a woman. The healing of the possessed man, the healing of Simon Peter's mother-in-law. The centurion's servant, the son of the widow of Nain, which is also a reminder of the mandate to care for the widow. This was her only son. When Jesus heals a crippled woman on the Sabbath day, similarly, Jesus heals a crippled man on another Sabbath. From beginning to end, or resurrection, and everything in between. This author says that Luke is clearly intentional about balancing stories that give equal inclusion of women and men in the same or similar circumstances. And there's lots of use of male and female pairings in Luke, including using the story of the prophet Jonah in Nineveh and the Queen of Sheba as examples of Gentiles who believed. And on and on and on. The repeating statements, changing the gender each time, is known as complementary discourse. It's a teaching method in which a statement or a lesson is applied equally to both women and men. Luke champions it, and it does show up in the other Gospels, but Luke is the one who really uses this. And it's a good reminder, I think, that when we see consistency across the scriptures, it's especially worth paying attention to. That's been something that, Gail, I have found really useful in deciding what to do with a passage that troubles me. Is this a consistent message? Is it telling me something new, or does it contradict some fundamental belief that I have that I feel valid to hang on to? And so R. Herbert concludes that the message of full inclusion of women in the gospel story was one that was particularly important to Luke. So I'm going to put together some resources that I can work with Gail to share with everybody, so you have a chance to read some more of this. This is a lovely article, the way it's laid out. So then we have Abigail and Bathsheba. And I really appreciate, Gail, that you mentioned Abigail to me, because growing up in a lectionary church, my first Methodist church being a lectionary church, and until a couple of weeks ago, I had no idea Abigail was a character in the Old Testament. And she's a really important character. So let me tell you a little bit about what goes on. So David, eventually King David, but not yet King David, he's fled from Saul and he's trying to build up a band of supporters. And along the way, he protects a guy named Nabal protects his workers and his property. And as is customary when you do that, David expects some hospitality in return. Nabal is considered a harsh and despicable man, and he refuses. And this infuriates David, and he plans to kill Nabal. While Nabal is on a drunken binge, Abigail, who has gotten wind of this, and she is Nabal's wife, and who deals with this apparently terrible human in her daily life, she intervenes with David and convinces him to spare Nabal's life. So in this picture, what you're seeing here is she's brought all sorts you can see food items there at her feet. And she's a woman of quite a bit of privilege. She's wealthy. She is obviously comfortable addressing somebody. I wouldn't say comfortable, willing to address somebody who is ready to kill her husband. She's quite a character. And she's known for being beautiful, and she's known for being virtuous and for being smart. So she goes to David. She makes this offering. She prostrates herself in front of him, even, which she probably didn't need to do, but she did. She really goes overboard in this. And she convinces David to spare Nabal's life. Well, she's going to go back home, and she does tell the now sobered up Nabal what she had done. Because she had, Nabal wasn't going to give anything away, but she gives away things, but she saves his life for a short time. He's now sobered up after this binge, but his heart fails inside him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Now, as I said, Abigail is a beautiful woman. And up to this point, and never in this story, is there any sexual impropriety involved. And even though she's a woman of possibly higher stature than David at the time of the story, and it's probably a hard life living on the lam, so to speak, which is what David's life is like right now, she agrees to marry him and becomes his second wife. And along the way, she foreshadows David's future kingship. It says, when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good things he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel. So she is speaking about what is going to happen. David is going to become king. So let's talk about David a little bit. I hadn't noticed that David is regularly quick to turn to murder, or to at least consider it. He's managed to resist killing Saul twice, once before this story and once afterwards. Abigail convinces him not to murder Nabal. But once the power gets to his head, after he takes Bathsheba and she is pregnant, he schemes to attempt to circumvent the consequences. But when that fails, he arranges for Bathsheba's husband Uriah to be killed, and he goes on to marry Bathsheba. Their first son dies. Their second son is Solomon, and he becomes king by David's decree. And eventually Bathsheba sat in a throne at his right hand. So one of the things that I came across, and I can recall having heard in the past, is that Bathsheba had some responsibility for the called it adultery. And I think even it's listed as adultery maybe in some of the headings. But the word for what David does, he takes Bathsheba. This is not consensual. Her bathing was likely a ritual bath following her period, and David took her. Cynthia Richty concludes in her portrait of Bathsheba in the CEB Women's Bible with this. She says, I see Bathsheba as a woman God empowered to stand firm and to say, no more broken promises. how often is that the very stance we need at work with a boyfriend or a spouse, extended family, or our children? So the stories that I heard about Bathsheba, the story I'd come across, I'd kind of forgotten that's what I'd heard. And then I was so struck by this very clear statement by some commentator that, well, Bathsheba did seduce him after all. Um, I think that Bathsheba's story is one of redemption and not one of guilt. She's redeemed from having been violated, not redeemed from having sinned. So Abigail and Bathsheba. So this is a really personal story to me. This is the story of the woman who is caught in adultery and brought in front of Jesus. Jesus went down to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he returned to the temple, and all the people gathered around him, and he sat down and taught them. The legal experts and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. Placing her in the center of the group, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone women like this. What do you say?" Test him because they wanted a reason to bring an accusation against him. Jesus bent down and wrote on the ground with his finger. They continued to question him, so he stood up and replied, "Whoever hasn't sinned should throw the first stone." Bending down again, he wrote on the ground. Those who heard him went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. Finally, only Jesus and the woman were left in the middle of the crowd. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Is there no one to condemn you?" She said, "No one, sir." Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, don't sin anymore." And this is a story we've probably all heard many times. And I'll spare you the personal details about what I was thinking about in my own life when someone shared this story with me recently. But it really struck me as going far beyond this particular encounter and far beyond Jesus and me to the system that I grew up in and in much of Christianity, being right with God, and the consequences of your sin being death, being not getting heaven. I think this tells us something completely different. Jesus says, no, don't sin. That's a problem, right? There's lots of consequences to sin. It's not condemnation. It's not. And I have found this encounter between Jesus and this woman to be revolutionary to me in really, really solidifying what I really understood to be different than what I was taught, but didn't have necessarily what I could really hang my truth on. And I can hang my truth on this. So let's talk about Sarah and Elizabeth. I hadn't heard Sarah and Elizabeth paired before. Maybe somebody has and I missed it. I'm all about that possibility. I have been in a season of noticing things. And so when I came across a comparison of Sarah and Elizabeth when they find out that each are pregnant, how do they react? Sarah laughed. She said, "Oh, that is such nonsense. Such nonsense." Elizabeth receives the news with gratitude. She says, "This is the Lord's doing. He has shown his favor to me by removing my disgrace among other people." And then later on, when Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. With a loud voice, she blurted out, "God has blessed you above all women, and he has blessed the child you carry. Why do I have this honor that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as I heard your greeting, the baby in my womb jumped for joy. Happy is she who believed that the Lord would fulfill the promises he made to her." The word joy, as soon as I heard your greeting, the baby in my womb jumped for joy. And one of the things that, on the one hand, I appreciate the commentator saying, "Oh, Sarah laughed." She said, "Oh, that's nonsense." And Elizabeth accepts the news. And yet I think perhaps there was laughter there. How many times have you been in a state of pure joy and found yourself laughing? Laughter is part of joy. And so I suspect, can you imagine when Elizabeth and Mary seeing each other? I can see them just clasping each other's hands and just, you know, filling with laughter, that laughter of joy. So, getting close to the end of what I have to say to share with you today, I want to give you a little look at what's going to happen next week. There's some other pairs that we're going to look at. We're going to look at Pua and Shipra. We are going to look at women who were evangelists, leaders, and teachers. Women who changed Jesus' mind. We're going to look at women who believed that they could be heard. And we're going to look for some missing women. Women who are there if we look closely enough. In the breakout session, you're going to be looking at two women. One who gets a lot more airtime in contemporary Christian circles than the other, but who both showed up very early in the Hebrew canon. So enjoy the conversation in your breakout groups. Really looking forward to hearing from you when we get back together. So I invite you to notice how these early female characters show up in each of the two books of the Hebrew scriptures. Enjoy your conversation. Hi, everybody. Is
Renee
everybody
was right in
back?
the middle of a thought.
Yeah, we were
Okay.
talking about when Moses was brought back to his mother, or back to who would become his mother from his real mother, and he was adopted, and it said in there it was when he was grown, and I think that's kind of like probably the 7 to 8 years old most people at that time thought that a child was grown. You know, that's when they could become a man, is or do start learning the rites of passage.
Yeah,
Is
that
I've
was
always
a real
heard.
revelation in that passage, that it wasn't that the mother went to the castle and nursed, was the wet nurse for her son in the palace, but that Pharaoh's daughter gave him back to his mother,
Mhm.
and she didn't take him back to the princess until he was whatever they considered grown.
Mm-hmm. So
How did they know? How did they know?
How did they know who? Oh,
I think it might have meant until he was weaned.
Yeah.
okay.
How did they know where the baby came from?
Well, the
Because
daughter,
Miriam went up to
the little sister.
princess, the older sister went up to the princess and said, "I'll find you a Hebrew woman to be your nursemaid."
And they knew he was Hebrew because he'd been circumcised.
Yes.
And
And
possibly
so,
the garments and blanket in the basket
Mm-hmm.
would have been.
mhm.
So you spent some time talking about the first story, or the story of Miriam, and it's presumably Miriam. She's not actually named there,
Right.
And her role in her brother's survival,
Mm-hmm.
Moses' survival. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What else did you talk about?
We talked about the neutrality of the word Adam, meaning human, in the first instance.
Mm-hmm. The first instance here we're talking about in the creation story, where male and female, God created them in God's
Mhm.
image, and then a second version of the story is told where the male character, the character we consider male, is named Adam.
Yeah, and that was the interesting thing. I mean, the question you asked about what were the roles and the descriptions in the first version in Genesis 1, it is gender neutral. He is giving these instruct, he created both. God gave direction to both, and there was no distinction. The man's going to do this and the woman's going to do that. In Genesis 2, it starts off with the gender neutral Adam, human, being created and given, the authority to name the animals and all that stuff. And then when God realized that the human was lonely, then there was this, putting the human to sleep and then creating woman. And I assume, my understanding has been that both male and female were created at that time. We think of Adam as a male name and we name boys Adam, but the Hebrew meaning of that word, from my understanding, was that it was just human. It was a gender neutral name. And then there were two who could then be fruitful and multiply.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
again, it wasn't, I think the overlay of women therefore are subordinate because they were created from man. I think that is a misogynistic interpretation of the story.
Absolutely.
Yep. I even used the word, convoluted. How did this get from here to, or extrapolated in such a convoluted manner? But
Well, it does seem to be a contradiction. The two stories are not fully aligned. And interestingly enough, in the second story, in the first story, they created at the same time. In the second story, Adam doesn't get through his first 24 hours without a partner. But God realizes very quickly that what God did was incomplete or not enough.
This is off on a different note, but something Marlene said in our breakout group reminded me of this. There's a movie that my husband and I like. It's called The Butcher's Wife with Demi Moore. It's a real good movie. It's not a religious movie, it's a romantic movie. But in that, they talk about the split apart, finding your true soul mate. And in part of the movie, someone tells the main character, just because you have a messed up version of Plato, and that's what comes to mind here, that we're incomplete without the other, that we're searching for this other part of ourselves, the rib taken from the human, and we complete ourselves by finding a partner. It just came to mind while we were talking about that. I just thought I'd share that.
And
if
I
you
think
I might broaden that just slightly to say that we complete ourselves by finding community. Because this creation of multiple humans was the beginning of community.
Yeah.
And people ask, if you read the stories chronologically, the very next chapter is about Cain and Abel, and they have kids, and there's other people in the world that Cain is worried about. And the question is, well, where did all those other people come from? And the answer could well be God created them at the same time, that God created community for us. And what
Mm-hmm.
he singled out was the Adam Eve story.
In the first story, let us make humanity
Mm.
in our image. In the divine image, God created them. Male and female, God created them. To Gail's point about, did God only create this first pair at that time?
Yeah, it doesn't say just one male and one female.
Right.
It
And
doesn't, there's no plural there also either, but it doesn't just say one of each.
and the very next chapter implies more were created.
Yeah.
And they all couldn't just come from Adam and Eve, or there wouldn't be a human race.
Right.
Yeah. And
People
going
are
back
like,
to
well, they.
Genesis. Yeah. And going back to Genesis 1, both male and female were given equal authority, equal responsibility, equal assignment.
Mm-hmm.
And also it gives some weight to the observation that in the first story, what the author was describing merisms, kind of the high, the low, the in, the out, the male, the female, but not everything else and in between.
I liked a description I heard a couple years ago that those are containers.
Yeah.
With
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you spend any time talking about how early woman shows up as a major player in the first book, and how early woman shows up as a major player in the second book.
No.
You mean in the two chapters in Genesis?
In actually in Genesis and Exodus.
Oh.
No, we did not.
That was a real aha moment for me, was the first two books in the first chapter of the first two books in the first few verses of the first two books.
Women are all over the place. Yeah.
We're everywhere.
Well,
as are the men. It was not an old men's club. It was not.
Well, we were kind of counting up. We went on to the second question, and we were kind of counting up how many different women were mentioned when Moses was saved from the river. Not just who helped get Moses to the river, but I mean, there was a ton of women in that verse. Moses wouldn't have ever been Moses if it hadn't been for all these women.
It took
working
a village.
Together.
Yes.
It took a village.
On both sides, supposedly, that nobody got along with.
Yes.
Those women worked together to save baby.
That was my question, is how did they know? And I was trying to get to that correlation. And that's why I finally said, to me, it almost sounds like an underground resistance among women, that they know what the score is and how they're going to have to circumvent it, but they have the privilege of their class status where to pull this stuff off, whereas a lot of women would not.
Oh, next week we're going to talk about Pua and Shipra and how they bridged that.
Those would be the midwives, right?
The midwives.
Right. Next week.
Who were delivering babies during this time of Moses, and secretly they were Hebrew midwives, and they were, I think, and they were secretly like not killing the babies as they had been ordered to by Pharaoh.
But it's their network. What I learned about their network, to Joe's point, this is an underground thing going on here. There's a network happening.
A resistance, a real resistance.
Yep.
And Moses' mom isn't the only one that was working to save her baby. I am positive there were hundreds of women doing the exact same underground railroad thing.
Yeah, Renee, that was something that really struck me when we were reading the description in the Common English Bible translation. Because so many times you hear the story that she went down to the river and just, floated him down the river.
Yeah. Yep.
No, it says she put him in the reeds. That means she put him in the quiet water
Where
off
he
to
was
the
safe.
side of the river, and that maybe that was a way that a lot of Hebrew women had of getting their babies rescued, was you
Oh,
put them in this waterproof basket and you put them in the reeds, and then somebody comes along and rescues them, just like an Underground Railroad kind of thing.
Yeah,
Or
but it
you
also
just,
didn't say anything about the princess. Oh, this day she decided for some unknown reason to go to the river. It sounds like the people went to the river all the time.
oh, they did. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to
it would
think
make
about
sense.
too, one of the things that I thought about in preparing the material and didn't use is the the craziness of killing all of the Hebrew males. Who's going to do the work?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to do the work if you kill
Mhm.
off all the men?
Mm,
If you kill off all
Because
the
this is the
boys, if they
slave
never
class,
mature?
right? Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right. But that's because I don't think the privilege, I don't know, I don't think that the privileged person, thought that it was just kind of illogical what he did. And we're trying to make sense of something
Well,
illogical.
the whole reason it happened was because the Hebrews had um, become so prolific that Pharaoh was afraid they
Right.
had enough power to take over. And that word that's used there is they were bone crunchingly strong.
Oh, wow.
And so
This
he
was his form
he
of
just wanted to
population
take out a
control, huh?
whole generation just to weaken them. That would not stop them, but it would weaken them enough
Right.
to keep them under
So,
control.
so here's my question. Even though I jumped to this underground resistance thing, there is no promise that the people get their baby back.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
In fact, I was listening to a podcast this morning about Vietnam and all the babies that had to be adopted out of Vietnam, and a lot of them had white. Their dads were, white servicemen from the United States, and so Australia, Canada, United States, and some of the place took them. And then when the Vietnamese people came to try to get their baby back, they couldn't because the names had been changed and so forth. So, I mean, there has to be some kind of understanding and network here going on for her to get her own child back, in my opinion. But
Mm-hmm.
Her
Well, if you think
sister.
about what happened during World War II, where Jewish mothers were giving their children away to non-Jewish but concerned and collaborative people who were hiding these children in their homes and pretending that they were, a niece or nephew whose parent died or something.
Mm-hmm.
Those Jewish mothers had no guarantee that they were going to get their children back. Their whole purpose was, I must save the life of my child, even
right.
if I don't survive. And it might have been the same thing in this case. Of the point was, I'm going to save my child, whatever happens
Mm-hmm.
beyond
That's
that.
like in our family. That's how Rhea, she was left someplace that they normally wouldn't have found her, except for
Mm,
some workers who were going through that field that day. Her mom knew what she was doing.
Yeah,
Get Rhea found.
yeah.
Ria is Renee's daughter.
mhm.
Yeah, Rhea's my youngest daughter. She was adopted from China when she was 11 months old.
Yeah.
Mm.
And it's just like this whole thing with all these women working together. It was like, that brought me to tears because it was like all I could think of is Rhea's mom. She did the
Mm.
same thing. She brought her someplace
I was
that
thinking
somebody was
about
going to be
that
working
too.
that day.
Yeah, the one child rule and
Yes.
how that was not so different from what Herod did with population
Mm-mm.
control.
Mm-hmm.
How did these many babies, and I don't know the number, get saved and nobody noticed that there was no baby anymore?
The
Mm.
story leaves a lot out.
Hmm.
It could have been the same as like with China's one child policy.
The
It was
shadow children, yeah.
it was common for somebody in the neighborhood, a relative or something, those children would die. whether usually before they were born, they had vans that went around China to all the villages and they did ultrasounds. And the ultrasound came out, it was a male. They said they didn't do anything, but if it came back as a female, they aborted it.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
so,
No.
and a lot of women hid that they hid they were pregnant. They went to visit somebody, or they just didn't leave their house and save the child, and then took the child. If it was a girl, they had to.
Yep.
Take us
So
someplace.
I'm sorry. So to Gail's point, a lot left out, but what we are left with is a number of women involved, and there had to be some kind of agreement, coalition between some women that worked together that resulted in Moses being able to grow up.
Mm-hmm.
Martha, I've got to thank you for, you know, picking
Wow.
these two passages and picking that particular translation of the Bible.
Yeah.
Because
I
that
already have that
really
Bible in
highlights
my
it.
cart because I didn't know it existed.
Yeah, I was going to say, Martha, thank you so much for all of your research and digging and
Yeah.
sharing that with us.
You're welcome.
I'm curious what your thoughts are, Brian, on all this.
Mhm.
Well, I always wondered, you know, when you think about, at first it looked like there was only Adam and Eve. Well, if you look at genetics at all, that would mean we would all be inbred. So I'm
Right.
glad they kind of threw in, you know, there was like a whole multitude created at once.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've always been fascinated by Lilith because so many horror stories and movies and things have been written about her. But what if she really wasn't evil? Maybe she was just vilified because of the patriarchy, didn't like a strong woman.
Yep.
Yeah. I've been learning a lot about Lilith from some of my friends, and it's like, huh. Because I always thought Lilith was just a mythical creature, like a beholder or whatever, And then you get to looking at some of the history stuff and some of the other things, some of the Gnostic writings about her. And it's like God made two people and one didn't mash right. And so then he's like, okay, I'm going to make them at the same time. And it's like, holy cat.
There are a lot of places where people think about this stuff deeply. These are, I think in the General Ramble series, when I started out with the first 6 chapters of Genesis, I pointed out then that this is a collection of the tribal stories
Mhm.
that were ideologies that explained, kind of reverse engineered why things are the way they are. All right. So why do we have different languages? Because of the Tower of Babel, Why do we have a rainbow? Because of the flood. Why do we eat meat? Because of the flood. Why do we have giants? Because of that weird chapter in early Genesis, well, why do we have male and female? Why do we have all these different things? Um, and the stories don't necessarily mesh because this person's grandma didn't tell it the same way that person's grandma told it.
Right.
And the Jewish tradition has always been to celebrate and retain that diversity. They don't try to make it all match, and they never have. So they may take a story, they took 2 flood stories and interleaved them. You can actually go through the flood stories and pick out. I think I did that in the when I covered that
Yep.
story. And we picked out the 2 different stories and saw how they told the story beginning to end in different ways. So you can't, and people didn't just stop with the writer of or the editor of Genesis we still think and pull together these things, and it's our nature to fill in the gaps. So when you're reading like the Gnostic writings or just be aware when you're reading speculation that it's speculation, and don't get bound up in the wrapping paper. Just try to look beneath it and see, is there some good truth that this helps me understand?
Well, and not only is the Jewish tradition to not have to make everything fit neatly, the Jewish tradition is also to ponder and to argue and to try to understand and to I think there's some parts that are like, well, this is what that means. But there are 16 people saying, well, this is what that means, and this is what that means. And they're way more comfortable with that than we Christians often are. And yet they are our heritage. They are our biblical forebears. Yes. And I think there's a lot to learn from their willingness to just engage the text and figure,
Right.
And listen to each other's opinion. I mean, they share like we do. Everybody has a little bit of something that takes from something else, and then y'all put it together and it all makes sense. Or at least it makes more sense.
It gives us I see it as a series of stepping stones, that appear, and we may turn and go another way and journey down another path for a while, but it's all in the interest of coming to know God better and coming alongside each other. That's why we're doing what we're doing.
I'm curious about. Oh, I was going to say, I'm curious what Anne and Mary are thinking too.
So, when God populated the world with animals, one can assume, because we haven't been told that he placed the male down and pulled a rib out and made the female, one can assume that he populated the earth with both male and female animals. So in doing so, why would he deviate from that plan when creating the animal called humans?
In the first story, God doesn't deviate from that plan.
Exactly. So, Joe Macho Man wrote the second one because he was butthurt because heaven forbid women had a brain. I also mentioned Lilith because she is seen as being Adam's first wife, and she didn't take any crap off of him. And so she was dismissed and often portrayed as a demon. But who knows? Who knows? And as far as Moses goes, yeah, I think it's natural for women to do everything they can to protect their little cubs.
Interesting. Mary, did you have something to add? I don't know if you're in a place where you can even unmute and talk. She may not be. She may be only able to listen this time. Same with Donna.
This has been so enlightening.
Hasn't it been?
Yeah.
Wow.
It'll be fun.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we will do this part 2 next week, same time, same station. Thank you to everybody for joining, and thank you so much to Martha for preparing this for us.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you all. Good to be with you today.
Good to
Good
see
to see
y'all.
y'all too. Love y'all. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.